It's my pleasure to welcome you to Northern Kentucky History Hour. I'm your host for tonight, Heather Cook, joining you from my dorm in Worcester, Ohio. Also joining me by the powers of Zoom is our presenter for the evening, Jack Dominic. Thank you for being here. Northern Kentucky History Hour is a project of Behringer-Crawford Museum, Northern Kentucky's history museum, that would not be possible without support. Thank you to all of our sponsors, including the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, ArtsWave, Kentucky Arts Council, the Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, the Carol Ann and Ralph V. Hale Jr. Foundation, and our members. If you're not yet a member of the museum, please consider joining for access to discounts and exclusive programming. Learn more and join at our website, bcmuseum.org. We would love to hear from our viewers tonight, so if you have a question or comment to share, please type it in the chat or the Q&A feature, and I will be sure to get to them at the end of the presentation. So let's meet tonight's speaker. Jack Dominic has served as Executive Director of the National Voice of America Museum of Broadcasting since March 2014. He is an adjunct professor at the University of Cincinnati, teaching in the E-Media Division of the College Conservatory of Music, and was formerly on the adjunct faculty at Northern Kentucky University. Dominic spent over 38 years in public broadcasting, retiring as Vice President and CET Station Manager at Cincinnati's public TV station CET. He writes and blogs about technology and media and has served on several national committees and working groups for public TV. In the 1980s, he was one of 5 participants in a Smithsonian Institution project that investigated the use of computer technology to map and photograph the entire United States and distribute this information electronically, a precursor to services like Google Earth. Thank you for being here, Jack.
You're welcome.
Before we get started, there is a quiz question tonight. The first respondent to enter a correct answer in the chat or Zoom or Facebook Live wins a Northern Kentucky History Hour prize and, most importantly, bragging rights. So tonight's question is, why was the phrase Cincinnati liars really a badge of courage? Please leave those answers in the chat. And Jack, if you are ready, you can go ahead and get started.
I am ready. Thank you very much. And really appreciate having the opportunity to share some information about an iconic institution located in the tri-state area. A lot of people know very little about the Voice of America and even less about Bethany Station, where I'm currently the executive director. So tonight we're going to just delve a little bit into what was the Voice of America, why was it here in northern Cincinnati, and how significant it is. Notice I said is, to millions of people around the world. While Bethany Station in Westchester, Ohio, which is the home of the museum, is no longer operational as a broadcasting facility, Voice of America continues to provide millions of people in more than 37 languages programming each day all over the world. And we'll talk about that just a little bit later. So with that, I'm going to share my screen here a little bit, and bear with me. If I will, come on, you can come up, you can do it. There we go. And just give me a second here. Slideshow. There we go. So again, really thankful to the Behringer-Crawford Museum and the History in Motion. This is such a cool idea, having these lectures. And if you don't mind, the Voice of America Museum may borrow this idea in the coming years. Many people have seen this building. It's located on Tylersville Road in Westchester, Ohio, about 25 miles north of Cincinnati. It's a pretty imposing structure, and the fact that it sits about a quarter of a mile back from Tylersville Road in an area which is otherwise tremendously filled with businesses and buildings, etc., seeing this acre after acre of grass and large building, lots of people kind of want to know what it's all about. Well, tonight, we're going to talk about the fact that the Voice of America at Bethany Station in Westchester was really a nexus, a connection of extraordinary technology and innovative programming. We got to go back to 1942 to get the genesis of the Voice of America. President Roosevelt called several broadcasters and equipment manufacturers to Washington, D.C., because he was quite concerned about the fact that the Nazis under Adolf Hitler were very sophisticated in using radio as a propaganda arm. And Roosevelt realized that the United States had no radio service that was capable of reaching Europe on a regular basis. So what he did is he called a bunch of people to Washington and shared with them the fact that Germany had 68 transmitters, and Hitler actually beaming Hitler's information to the German people. Hitler actually subsidized the price of an inexpensive radio called the Volksempfänger. And he had a staff of thousands of people that did nothing but produce propaganda. Perhaps you watch the History Channel or other cable channels, and you watch some of the movies that were produced by the Germans. And of course, everything was good and great, and the propaganda just flowed and flowed and flowed. In the United States, on the other hand, the United States only had 13 shortwave transmitters that were even capable of reaching Japan or Europe. And there was a small disjointed office of people trying to figure out what information we could send around the world that would assist, especially in the war effort. I talked about the Volksempfänger. This is a very special radio. Remember I said that Hitler wanted his people to only listen to him. So he had his engineers create this radio, and if you come to the museum, you'll see one. The radio was different in a number of ways. Number one, it had no numbers on the dial, only cities: Bonn, Hamburg, Berlin, Frankfurt. You get the idea? You could listen to any radio station as long as it was a German radio station. But he wasn't satisfied with that. Excuse me. He wasn't satisfied with that. So when you went to your store, maybe your Berlin Best Buy, and bought this radio, it had a little tag on the volume control when you brought it home. Now, I presume that most of the people watching tonight don't speak German. So I translated it for you. And for those who maybe have a small screen, I'll read it to you. So you bring your radio home, you take it out of the box, and the first thing you see is think. Listening to foreign broadcasts is a crime against the national security of our people. It's the Führer's order, punishable by prison and hard labor. In other words, if you mess around with this radio, you could go to prison. That's how serious Hitler was. He wanted people to listen to all Hitler all the time. So as I said, President Roosevelt didn't know quite how to counteract this. So he asked some of the major broadcasters and broadcast groups and equipment manufacturers to come to Washington. And he said, who can build high-power shortwave transmitters in the shortest amount of time so that we can send our messages to Europe? And most of the people in that room sat around and looked at their shoes. Nobody raised their hand, except a gentleman from Cincinnati, Ohio, who happened to work for Crosley Corporation. And he essentially said, we're already doing that. What did he mean? Well, Powel Crosley Jr., you may be familiar with, was an unbelievably talented individual. who created so many inventions and products. We have a whole museum dedicated to it. But as it related to radio, one of the things that he was able to do in the late 1930s, and this is before the Voice of America, he had WLW, that's right, 700 WLW, operating at 500,000 watts. Well, put that into perspective. An AM radio station today is only allowed to broadcast at 50,000 watts. So the engineers in Cincinnati already knew how to build high-power transmitters. But also, and most people don't realize this, across the street from WLW's transmitter here in Westchester was another transmitter, and it was WLWO, and it was an international shortwave radio station capable of reaching Europe. So when the gentleman from Crosley said, "We're already doing that," he was absolutely serious. Well, so the federal government gave the contract to build out the first transmission facility for the new Voice of America to the Crosley Corporation. And then things really started to happen. First of all, it was built in between 12 and 18 months. That is an amazing pace. Of course, we were during the war. The transmitters here at Bethany Station operated continuously from 1944 to 1995. And they housed the most powerful shortwave transmitters in the world. From this hillside, just north of Cincinnati, we could reach Europe, North Africa, and South America. Many people remember driving to Dayton on I-75 and looking to the east, and all you saw was antenna after antenna after antenna after antenna. It was 1 square mile of transmitting antennas.
In Bethany, Ohio, on the last year's cornfield, there stands tonight a forest of wires and towering poles. They are shortwave radio towers, arranged in rhythmic patterns, so that at a moment's notice they can be beamed on 24 different lands in 5 of the world's 6 warring continents. These shortwaves are not like those of our standard broadcasting band. They do not die out in a few hundred miles. They are the siege guns of radio, the heavy artillery, guns of war that can hurl explosive facts against the enemy's weapons of lies and confusion anywhere in the world. They are also potential guns of peace that can be turned against misinformation and ideas that lead to war. Tonight, we are dedicating the newest and most powerful group of shortwave broadcasting stations in the world, built for our government by the Crosley Corporation. 3 brand new transmitters of 200,000 watts power each. For those who have built them, this is a proud achievement.
That was the head of the FCC at the time, giving remarks here in Bethany Station. Well, we could talk about technology all evening if we wanted to, but as I said before, we really need to take a look not only at the technology that was developed, and it was significant, but also the creative and unique way of programming. Now, here's where it gets pretty interesting. At least it got interesting for me. From the very outset, President Roosevelt saw the Voice of America as a propaganda arm. He figured if Hitler could do it, we could do it. But over the years, leading up to the sign-on of Voice of America, he changed his mind. And that's because he hired in leadership roles people like John Houseman, Elmer Davis, who was with CBS. Perhaps the one name on this slide that you would remember is Edward R. Murrow, the quintessential news person. Edward Johnson from right here in Scripps Howard. All of these people went to Roosevelt and said, "Mr. President, we think it's a wonderful idea to send our information to people around the world, but it's got to be truthful. When we do things right, we should say we did things right. When we do things wrong, we should say that we do things wrong.
The news that the Voice of America would be carrying to the world in the first half of 1942 was almost all bad news. As Japanese victories and invasions followed one another with sickening regularity, and the Nazi armies moved ever deeper into Russia and the Near East, we would have to report our reverses without weaseling. Only thus could we establish a reputation for honesty, which we hoped would pay off on that distant but inevitable day when we could start boasting of our own invasions and victories.
So in other words, Roosevelt was talked into treating the Voice of America as a news service. We would not turn it into a propaganda arm. Well, it's interesting. Did it work? Well, our museum is open every week, every weekend, and it's almost every week someone will come to the museum from a foreign country. And it's truly moving when they come to the museum. Some of them actually have tears in their eyes because they will relate. Yes, I listened to the Voice of America and fill in the blanks. I was in my grandma's attic because we weren't allowed to listen to it during the Cold War. Or I was under the blanket in my bedroom, fearing that the neighbors would hear me. So we normally ask the guest who come, why did you believe the Voice of America as opposed to other radio services? And almost to a person, they will say something like, well, you guys aired the Watergate hearings live to the world. Or we listened to the launches of various spacecraft and sometimes they blew up. Or the Kennedy assassination, etc. In other words, we weren't always just reporting good stuff, but we were reporting things that we thought people should know.
Well, the difference between local news like Radio Moscow and the Voice of America was that Voice of America did report the facts and did report true facts. In the Soviet Union, airplanes never crashed and crops were always good.
Czechoslovakia, this atmosphere of oppression, the only moment of hope occurs when we hear the Voice of America.
The impact of VOA is tremendous. I would say if you ask anybody of my age in China, especially college graduates, everybody can echo on my point. VOA give them access to the outside world and also open the mind.
Those are just a few of the quotes that we've lifted from people who come to the Voice of America. Remember the Volksempfänger that we talked about a little bit earlier? That if you modified the radio to be able to listen to the Voice of America or the BBC, you could go to prison. Well, not too many years ago, about 5 years ago, a gentleman and his wife came to the museum. And he knocked on the door because we weren't open. It was a Monday. And I went down and greeted him and said hi to him. And he said, I don't want to see your museum. What I want to do is I want to give you something. And he presented me with this transistor radio. Now, it looks like most any transistor radio, doesn't it? Well, it's a little bit different. He related to me that he bought this radio. He was Ukrainian. He lived in Ukraine during the Cold War. And he bought this radio about 1960-61, and it was Soviet made. But just like the Volksempfänger, it did not have the proper bands to be able to receive the Voice of America or the BBC. But then he gets this big smile on his face, and he leans in and he says, but I knew a guy. So there was a person in his village who knew a lot about electronics that rewired the radio for Felix and Lola. And Lola said, we called it our under the blanket radio. That's just an example of how people will go to great lengths to listen to information that they cannot get anywhere else. Now, as I said before, the Voice of America today remains strong. The Voice of America is only one of several government-sponsored external broadcast services. For those of you who are in the military, perhaps, or were an expat for some other reason, you may have listened to the Armed Forces Radio Network. That's one of the government-sponsored external broadcasting services, but that is essentially a way for American expats to listen to the Super Bowl or other American television and radio programs. And of course, there's Radio Marti, which is a Spanish service mainly for Cuba audiences. There is the Voice of America. And there's one other one. Remember, I said that Roosevelt really wanted a propaganda arm. So there is another radio service of the US government, and it's called Radio Free Europe. And it tends to be a little bit more propaganda-ish than the Voice of America. I also noted that the Voice of America in Bethany Station is no longer operational. And the reason for that is that technology moves ahead. When this building was built, people could only receive radio signals over great distances via shortwave, and they had to be very powerful shortwave. But in the 1970s and 80s, satellite technology came in and making the Voice of America heard around the world a lot easier. So today, the Voice of America mostly uses the internet, social media, cellular, and satellite technologies, and currently programs in some 37 different languages. There are a few places on Earth that the Voice of America still uses shortwave, and that would be places like North Korea. Not too many people in North Korea have the internet or a cell phone. The programming is diverse. It's news, it's educational, it's entertainment. If you come to the museum, and we hope you will someday, you'll see a vast array of displays about the Voice of America and the most significant collection of Crosley Brothers products and innovations. The Crosley Corporation and the Crosley Brothers were responsible for everything from refrigerators to radio stations to cars to airlines to airplanes to hair growing machines. And you can see all of those when you come to the museum. And then, of course, there's a vast exhibit, and it's being redone as we speak, on the unique history of radio and television in the greater Cincinnati area. So that's essentially what the Voice of America is all about. And I would be delighted and pleased to field any questions that might come forth.
Yeah, so we don't have any questions quite yet.
All right.
But we could talk about the trivia question because nobody got it 100% correct, but we did have a couple answers that were
Close.
Pretty close. So we'll see what you think. The first answer we had come in was, it says the broadcasts from the VOA were reaching beyond the Iron Curtain in Europe, Castor's Cuba, USSR, and China. The communist regimes referred to the broadcast as fake propaganda.
Pretty close.
And then someone else said that didn't Hitler call the broadcasters a VOA that?
That's the real answer. Hitler, in several speeches to his people, and I'm sure you've seen on cable when the History Channel, he would address thousands of people, in stadia and on radio, and several times he said, because he knew people were listening to the Voice of America, he said, "Pay no attention to those Cincinnati liars."
So congrats, Janine, and everyone else for setting in your answers. We did have a fun little story. Peter Neroni said that he regularly listened to the VOA while in Togo, West Africa as a Peace Corps volunteer. So that's pretty cool. Thanks for sharing that. And that we don't have any questions in yet. So while people get their questions in, is there anything else you would like to talk about?
Well, we talked a little bit about, and I kind of glossed over it. We have a very significant wing of the museum is dedicated to the Crosley brothers. And the reason, of course, as I mentioned before, the only reason the Voice of America chose Cincinnati as its transmission site was the people that knew how to build the transmitters were in Cincinnati. This place could have been in Fargo. This place could have been in St. Louis. There's no magic of it being in Cincinnati, except the talent to build it was in Cincinnati. But the Crosleys alone are amazing story in itself. Crosley actually came late to radio. He was already a very wealthy man making money on a variety of other things. He had a whole line of kitchen appliances, stoves and refrigerators, etc. A really interesting thing is we have them on display at the museum. We just commemorated D-Day in the United States, the 80th anniversary of D-Day. And at the museum, you will see a radio made here in Cincinnati by Crosley, which was the main source. Over 50,000 of these radios were manufactured and went ashore with our troops on D-Day. That's how they communicated. We have another exhibit that is perhaps one of the most significant, and that is, again, during the Second World War. All of us remember there were several top secret projects. Of course, the Manhattan Project comes to mind, the atomic bomb. But what doesn't come to mind is the proximity fuse. Now, that sounds like a mouthful, doesn't it? Well, the proximity fuse was manufactured by Crosley here in Cincinnati. And what it was is any aircraft guns shooting at airplanes, if you wanted to bring the airplane down, the enemy airplane, you had to hit it. And that was very difficult because the guns were not very accurate. The ship is going back and forth, and you're shooting at a target that's going in more than 200 miles an hour. So some scientists at Johns Hopkins University and over in the UK came up with an idea to mount on the tip of an outgoing ordnance coming out of a gun, a cannon, okay, big, a radio. And that radio, when it leaves the gun, sends out a signal. And it bounces that signal off of a piece of metal, which might be an airplane. And when it bounces back to the shell, it explodes. So you didn't have to hit the airplane because the shrapnel from the shell would bring the airplane down. Thus the name, proximity fuse. Thousands of these were manufactured in top secret, right down in North Side, right next to the expressway. And most Cincinnatians had absolutely no idea that this was going on. The Crosley engineers did not invent the proximity fuse. They were charged with taking this little battery-powered radio, and remember, we're talking the 1940s here, had a tube in it and a battery, and hardening it to handle the tremendous amount of G-forces coming out of that gun. And that's what the Crosley engineers were able to do. So we have a variety of those kind of exhibits. And the third one, which is one of my favorites because people don't believe it, and that is in 1939, Crosley provided an electronic newspaper to Cincinnatians. And we have the machine that he did it with. Pretty cool.
Yeah. I never knew that like Cincinnati had such ties to the war. Just pretty crazy too, because my college, Worcester, also has ties to the war too. We have an alum that worked on the atomic bomb.
Yep. Well, they didn't want you to know.
Yeah. We do have some questions in now.
All right.
So the first one is, how did the decision come around to transform Bethany Station into the museum, and what did it take to make that happen?
Well, it's not finished yet. In the late 90s, when the federal government closed the building or closed the facility, after it sold off some property, and if you've been out to Westchester, there's a hospital and a Home Depot and a Bob Evans and probably every restaurant known to man adjacent to the museum. The federal government took care of that, and then they gave the land to the township, which was then Union Township, but is now called Westchester Township. And Westchester Township, and by the way, the land must always be a public facility, open to the public. It can never be developed, the remaining land. So if you come out here today, you'll see a lot of it is park area, athletic fields from Butler County Metro Parks, and then the museum itself. And so about 2002, when the place closed, a lot of people already said this needs to be a museum. And it took a long time to get it going. So we really didn't do a lot of work in earnest till about 2010. And over the years now, we've been raising money. We get no money from the federal government, no money from the VOA. It's all individual contributions or grants, et cetera. So over the years, we have gradually redone the building to make it a museum, which is very, very difficult. It's an industrial building. It has steps and curbs and narrow passageways, et cetera. And also, we have the challenge of turning this building into a museum because the building was built essentially to take a direct bomb hit. In other words, it is solid. The interior walls are concrete. We don't have any drywall in this building. So modifying this building is very, very difficult. But about 2010, 2014, and then gradually we have been, for instance, we're in the process right now of putting environmental heating, air conditioning. The building never had heat. Why would you need heat when you have 6 200,000-watt transmitters running 24 hours a day? I think the ambient temperature of Westchester was 2 degrees warmer than it was. So anyway, so those are some of the things.
And somebody else had asked if there were any Crosley cars left.
Yes, we have one. We have a Crosley Hotshot. And it is, yep, it's cool. In fact, before we brought it, put it in the museum, one of our volunteers drove it around.
So it still runs?
Yep. Well, it obviously now all the gas is drained out of it, but before we brought it into the museum, yes, the donor of that particular car was from Texas, and he drove it daily.
Wow.
The only modification to the car is in order to license it, he had to put seatbelts in it. But that's the only modification.
I see. So nobody else is sending questions yet, so please get your questions in so we can get those answered for you. Is there anything else you want to talk to? Maybe talk about how you got interested in this?
Well, we could talk. One of the things we could talk about is, if anybody is interested in, well, obviously, if they're watching this Zoom, they're interested in history, and we're always looking for volunteers that are interested in history. We don't necessarily need a volunteer who has any knowledge of radio or electronics, et cetera. No. What we need is people who like history, like to learn the history of the Voice of America, and then perhaps become a docent. We have a lot of volunteer docents who regularly give tours to our guests. So a little commercial there. If anybody wants to volunteer, you can always easiest is just go voamuseum.org and you can go from there. We also have a variety, if you go there, and we also have a YouTube channel, and we have tons of short videos about the Crosleys, about Bethany Station, about the broadcasts, etc. And also, if you go to our website, around the museum, we have touch screens. And one of the touch screens, for instance, we have collected the real newscasts, not mock-ups, not reenactments, but the real newscasts of momentous occasions that happened while this place was in operation. So you can touch and get how they announced the moon landing, or the Cuban Missile Crisis, or the Kennedy assassination, or John Glenn orbiting the Earth. And these are the actual broadcasts. You could do it on a touchscreen at the VOA, or you can go to our website and do it there.
Nice. So we got some more questions in. The first one is, what's the status of the Media Broadcasting Museum?
The what? One more time.
What's the status of the Media Broadcasting Museum?
I think what they're referring to is the Media Heritage exhibits, which is the local broadcasting. And as recently as today, I walked through with some construction people. We have where that used to be located at the museum has been totally gutted. It is undergoing a total renovation with heating, and who would have thought, heating and air conditioning and carpeting and paint and lights, etc. And that will be coming back in the probably in early 25. And then we have another exhibit hall that we haven't got funded yet that is also going to be dedicated to media heritage type things.
So the next question is where you get the funding for your modifications.
The modification that we just finished was an individual donor. Well, I can say who it is because his name's on the room. His name is Elliot Block, and he donated enough money to do a new multi-purpose room, new restrooms, and a new ADA compliant restrooms, excuse me, which are very important. As I said before, our building is fraught with steps and little, making it nearly impossible for somebody with a walker or a wheelchair. So one of the things we did is that all those levels that were up and down, we poured concrete, and it's one level from the parking lot to the museum. No steps. So now the current the current projects that we're doing, which includes paving our parking lot, which looks like the Burma Road right now, and heating and air conditioning. I keep stressing that. There's very little heating and air conditioning in the entire building. We're solving that. And then also new electrical, etc. Most of the things we're doing right now, people will never see. In other words, it's very difficult to see an air conditioner, but believe me, you know that it's there. And that was funded. We were able to go after some state of Ohio capital funds. So that's the first time we've been able to get government funds for the capital improvements.
So what are the museum hours?
Museum is open every Saturday and Sunday from noon until 4. And then if you have a group, maybe a fraternal club, a sorority, church group, senior citizens group, teacher group, student group, we can do private tours anytime. You want to do it on Monday at 10 o'clock, you want to do it at Tuesday at 6 in the evening, with advance notice, obviously. We can do group tours. There is a minimum charge for group tours because we have to open the building. And because regularly to visit the museum, it's $10 a person. For group tours outside of our regular hours, there's a minimum of $150 or 15 people. If you bring 10 people, it's still $150. But if you bring 20 people, it's only $200. So, but it is a minimum of $150 for the group tours outside of noon until 4 on Saturday and Sunday.
And so did the VOA have any collaboration with Armed Forces Radio?
One more time.
Did the VOA have any collaboration with Armed Forces Radio?
Not really. I'm sure they talk to each other, but they're totally two different animals.
Yeah.
As I said before, they're all part of the U.S. government's external broadcasting service, which is all under one umbrella, but they're separate organizations.
And where are the current VOA operations located?
Well, the studios have always been and still are in Washington, D.C. There were never any studios here in Cincinnati. The programs were sent via special long-distance phone lines to Cincinnati and then broadcast. But the studios are still located in in Washington, D.C. And you can visit, and they do have tours. They then, as far as places like Bethany Station, there is one location in North Carolina that still has a shortwave service. Remember, I said we still use shortwave somewhere, but then spread all over the world are what we call relay stations. And those are literally all over the world, and they're fed by satellite.
And so someone is asking what the equipment behind you is.
Easy. This is the master control for Voice of America. From here, they operated 6 250,000-watt transmitters, and out on the lawn, there, I shouldn't say lawn, the 1 square mile of grass, there were over 20 antennas. Each of the antennas were about the size of 6 football fields. So this was a control room, and then the transmitters were located. If you look over my head, you see the Greek flag, and underneath that would have been a transmitter, and there would have been 3 transmitters back there and 3 transmitters in front of me too. Each transmitter is the size of 3 city buses. So very large.
And while we are waiting for people to get any more questions in, would you like to talk about maybe how you got interested in doing this?
Well, I retired. I worked for public broadcasting for almost 39 years. And when I retired, the board of directors of this organization, it's a 501c3 nonprofit organization, approached me and asked me if I would come out. I told them I'd give them 2 years. That was in 2014. So that's how I got involved in it.
Nice. Yeah, so is there anything else you would like to touch on, maybe that you didn't get to talk about in the presentation?
Well, not really. I think we've covered it pretty well. I think the one thing that I think surprises people, remember, Voice of America was never meant for you. So it's not at all surprising that most Americans have absolutely no idea what it was, what it is, because it wasn't for you. Nevertheless, the impact that these broadcasts had on geopolitical geopolitics can't be underestimated. Yes, it started in the Second World War, but if you really think about it, by the time VOA really got ramped up, the war was coming to an end. It was the Cold War that the Voice of America really was important. And again, almost every week, somebody will come to the museum and say, I learned about, there's that everything I'm hearing from Radio Moscow or blah, blah, blah may not be the truth. And so it's, I think it's the significance of what happened on this site can't be overestimated.
Thank you again to all of the sponsors and supporters of BCM. Until next time, take care, everyone, and good night.